Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for coming. This is our final session of the deep dive series for this academic year, where we're focusing on inclusive teacher residencies. And so really quick, just a quick summary, if you go to the next slide. We have had 2 sessions already. The first session was really context setting and was very data heavy. We talked a lot about the context of inclusive education, of inclusive teacher education, like why it's important. And so if you want to go back to watch that, it is in our resources page, which Dahlia will put into the chat for everyone. It is linked there, so you can re-watch that and access any of the resources, the slides, and any of the materials from session 1 and session 2 there, and then also all of the resources from today. They are all in one document that has 3 different tabs, so that way it's an easy one-stop shop for everything. Our last session, Allegra's going to dive into like a little bit of a review of that so that you have the context for today's session. And if you go to the next slide, I'm just going to revisit some of the biggest learnings from the first session, which we did revisit last time, but just in case you missed us last time, the first takeaway from that data-heavy session that I talked about a second ago is that inclusive teacher preparation really requires the intentional collaboration between general and special education. So that's why we're here today. That's what this whole series is about. Our second biggest takeaway was that inclusion works best when systems are designed proactively, not retroactively. So again, that's why we're here today. We're trying to make sure that you have whatever tools you need to be reflective and create those inclusive teacher education spaces in your residency programs. Our third biggest takeaway was that the data that we shared really highlights the urgent equity challenges in California classrooms. Our students don't look like our teacher population. The demographics are not matching, and that causes a lot of issues, including issues with referrals to special education. Students of color tend to be referred more often for special education services, and there's a lot of reasons for that, and we dove into that a lot in the first session. And the fourth one is that residency programs have the capacity to strengthen inclusive preparation through those 5 key design areas that we talked about in the first session. Shared clinical practice, integrating the coursework between general education and special education teacher preparation, co-developing your mentor training systems, sharing assessment and improvement processes, and recruiting together between general and special education. And with that, I'm going to welcome back Dr. Allegra Johnson for our final session as we continue to build on the work that we started together from session 1 and 2. In our last session, she helped us think deeply about what it means to create those learning spaces that are inclusive, where every learner is affirmed and celebrated. With more than a decade of experience as a special educator, a district leader, and an adjunct professor, Dr. Johnson brings deep expertise in the mindsets, coaching practices, and collaborative structures that make inclusive education possible. Her work centers on supporting adults to shift their beliefs and practices so that students with learning disabilities can thrive in those general education settings. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Dr. Johnson.
Thank you. Thanks, Kate. Good morning, everyone. We'll just jump right in and do a revisit of session 2 and kind of touch on some of those big ideas and big takeaways that we focused on during that session. And then we'll talk about how we're going to build upon those for today. In our second session, we really talked about how inclusive preparation requires really intentional systems design. And so we looked at 3 different elements of your system that you would really want to look at and align as much as possible with your goals around inclusion for your program. So that's things like looking at instructional practices, looking at case management and support, and then looking at what is the culture of collaboration that you are creating for the residents in your program. The second big takeaway that we really looked at was just thinking about kind of change management in general, and that when we want to make shifts or make adjustments, that the work isn't about starting over. It's really about building on what's already present in your program and leveraging those assets to fill in whatever gaps you see along the way. And so we spend a lot of time really just looking at like where are we already strong in our inclusive programming and where are some small tweaks that we could make to make that alignment more, intentional and sustainable. And then another big takeaway that we really looked at, again, is this idea around, high impact changes that are happening through small shifts. So repurposing your existing structures, really clarifying expectations around roles and responsibilities, and then scaffolding your resident learning so that we're really looking more at alignment and not so much as like adding things onto our programs, but really just aligning what already exists and what's already there. And so before we kind of jump into talking about today, I would love for the folks who were with us for session 2 to just drop in the chat which one of these big takeaways really stuck with you since that last session. So was it around, like starting with assets, not just looking at your gaps, looking at small alignments, really aligning your system in the areas of instruction, collaboration, and communication, like what's really stuck with you? What has stuck with you since that second session? All right, thanks Nadine for getting us started, clarifying expectations, communication, start small, repurposing. Yeah, just really thinking about it from a systems perspective, looking at existing alignment, wonderful. Yeah, I think we all know that in education, we have a tendency to sometimes want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And this is really just about like taking a step back, looking really big picture, what's already working, what can be refined, what can we like improve upon. Another thing I would love to know since the last time we were together, for those of us who were with us for session 2, is how have some of these takeaways shown up in your work? So maybe like a recent conversation that you had or a decision that you needed to make about programming, either for this, this current cohort of residents that you're working with or the next cohort of residents that you want to work with. Could a couple of people just share with us, like, what are some of the ways that this has like functionally shown up for you in your day-to-day? So our goals for today is really to look at how can we translate some of the gaps that we looked at from our last session into more of a program level strategy. So really thinking about like taking ideas to like larger program strategy. We're going to look at some really key drivers to think about when we, again, are designing intentionally for inclusive programming. And then I'm going to share a tool with you that is going to help you design kind of like a theory of action so that you can take this idea really into full fruition. We're going to have time in a breakout session for you to get some peer feedback and support from one another, but I'll also be asking some like very specific questions for folks to respond to in the chat, so that hopefully that way that's just another opportunity for us to see where there might be some like open doors for collaboration across programs. So this is just a very general agenda that we're going to go through today. We'll spend about the first 50 minutes talking about coherent program strategy, and it won't just be me talking at you the entire time. There will be opportunities for, for like engagement and input, and then also a breakout room session. We'll take a break. We will have a panel discussion. We'll have a Q&A, and then we will close out for the day. Before we get started, though, I do just want to reshare the learning community norms that I offered the last time we met together. Again, I think the value of this space is that you just have so many people, doing similar work, but in different contexts, and we're all at very different places in this work. And so just having as much of an opportunity to share and kind of co-create and, co-analyze together, I think is just really rich. And so I offer these learning norms to help kind of put us all in the right like frame of mind so that we are sharing really openly and just getting the most out of this space as possible. And so I'm not going to read these out to you, but please just go ahead and take a couple of minutes and scan the norms and think about which one do you think will really support you in participating in the space today, and drop that into the chat. All right, no one enters empty-handed. Perfection is not a prerequisite for participation. Together we know a lot. Allow more than one things to be true. Love it, love it, love it. Love it, love it. And as always, like, anything that you see in the facilitation and you think that it would be really great for your teams or any conversations you're going to be having moving forward, like feel free to just like steal it and use it. All right, so one of the things that I opened up with in our last session that I just wanted to kind of reiterate is that the lens that I'm bringing to this conversation that I'm facilitating today is coming from lots of different angles. I've in the past and currently I'm a sitting, district special education leader. I've been an adjunct professor. I've been a program supervisor in residency programs. I am, kind of doing the work from lots of different angles. And some of the things that I've really noticed and think about a lot, both from, the work that I do with Alder as a adjunct professor, and then the work that I'm doing here in the district, onboarding new employees and really trying to support IEP teams, is just thinking about that during the residency experience, the cognitive load for our residents is so high. There's so much that they are learning kind of theory behind and trying to apply it, and then just all of the dynamics of what's going on in their placement. There's just so much of a cognitive load that's happening for them that sometimes I worry as an instructor, like how deeply are they really able to embed kind of all of the practices and theories and recommendations and coaching that we're giving to them, because there are just so many things that they have to like do and remember for coursework, for EdTPA, just for all of it. The cognitive load is just really, really high. And I think about how is that, really impacting kind of like their integration of information and then their transference of that when they move into that first year of teaching. And then as a district administrator, as we are getting new teachers coming out of some of these programs, I think about that, during the context of the program, we talk about inclusion, we talk about inclusive programming in a very specific way. But that first placement that our graduates step into may not be as inclusive as we kind of like set them up to believe. So how are we also just equipping them for the understanding and the reality that first placement that they move into, if it isn't where they, did their residency, like may be very different, and how can we give them kind of the mental tools and frameworks to be able to shift and pivot to accommodate that. And so as we're having our conversation today, I would really love for you also to be thinking about the extent to which this might be true for your residents. Is there any feedback or information that you're getting from them to show that these are things that are present for them as well, so that can just be an additional design consideration that you're thinking about today? As I'm saying this, curious if this is kind of sparking any thoughts or reactions in folks, like thumbs up in the chat if this is something that you feel might be true for your residents, or some feedback that you have heard from them in the past. Curious if this is feeling relevant to other folks, or reflective of the experience that their residents are reporting. All right, definitely, absolutely feeling overloaded. I'll keep an eye to see if there are a couple more. I see a couple of thumbs up going up. Yeah, so just something that for us to really, really be kind of explicitly considerate about as we're thinking about, how we might need to shift or adjust our program strategies. And so a frame that I would love to offer to you is just that when we're thinking about really strong residency programs, there are three things that we want to think about making sure are included. One, that our inclusive practices are really embedded into our existing structures. And this is really just to get away from that feeling of like inclusion being one additional thing that teachers have to do. We want to talk about it in the most integrated way as possible and have it integrated in or embedded in as many structures as possible, so that it just feels like for our residents that, collaborating across general education and special education is just totally normal and natural. Incorporating elements of IEPs into our lesson planning is just something that we do. It's just a natural part of their process, not something additional that they have to think about on a day-to-day basis. We want to make sure that we're providing a lot of scaffolded opportunities for our residents to practice collaboration. I think the thing that I see kind of on the K-12 side is that for as much as we talk about the importance of inclusive practices in IEP meetings or maybe staff meetings or PLC meetings, our teachers are really just reporting that they don't have like a really strong vision or a lot of like past experiences to think about around like what does really effective, consistent collaboration look like? It wasn't something that they really practiced in their preparation programs. It isn't necessarily something maybe that they got support with from their administrators. So what does this collaboration really look like? How are we giving folks kind of a really effective mental model around what successful collaboration between general education and special education needs to look like? And then again, really just preparing our residents that they will walk into multiple different school contexts throughout the span of their career. And at the school level, inclusion can be defined really just differently than at the district level, than at how we kind of frame inclusion within our programs. And so really just preparing residents for that so it doesn't feel like such a shock to the system, or they feel like, skills from one area aren't transferable over into another. And so to ground this really specifically into the thinking that we're going to do today, I just want to offer 3 drivers for us to think about. So 3 drivers for us, really incorporating into our program design, those being instructional designs for inclusion, collaborative systems, and then really thinking about what does sustainable learning look like. And we'll walk through a couple of examples together so that you can kind of see these like in action, and then you'll have an opportunity in a breakout room to think about this in the context of your program and get some feedback and support from your Java-like peers. All right, I'm going to pause and just scan the chat really quickly. Thank you. And thank you for those of you who are contributing in the chat. So lastly, again, just to kind of build a bridge between our second session and this last session, in session 2, we talked a lot about what are the existing assets in your program, what are some of the gaps in your program, and how can we start to align those. And the goal in those activities was really, or the goal from that activity was really for us to just think about how can we leverage what's already existing in our program to start to create some momentum in doing this work. For today, we want to kind of zoom out a little bit and think about overarchingly, like, we really hope for our residents, all of our residents, to have in terms of inclusive programming. How can we connect that to these 3 drivers that we're going to talk about today? And what does that look like in terms of an overall program design strategy? So that hopefully you're walking away with a better understanding of how to connect all of these different dots into something that's really comprehensive and cohesive that everyone can wrap their minds around so that it can be really present in the decisions that you're making, the conversations that you're having as a team. All right, so starting with our example. Say your overarching desired outcome, the desired program outcome that you have is that you want all of your residents to graduate prepared to design and implement instruction that supports students with IEPs in general education classrooms. That is, your desired overall programming support. If we were to look at this through the lens of all of the different drivers, looking at key driver number 1, instructional design, how could we really think about how to incorporate and build our residents' ability to learn how to translate information that's in the IEP to instructional planning and to classroom practices? How can we kind of backwards design this to happen? And another thing that I also would love to invite folks to do is, as I'm going through the examples that I've created, if this is something that you're already doing in your program, I would love for you to shout yourself out in the chat. One, just to keep adding on to this kind of spirit of, building from our assets, identifying our strengths, and really building from those. But also, I think it'll be really helpful for other folks in the room just to see like, oh, okay, well, this program has already started incorporating, accommodations into their lesson planning process. I would really love to see an example of that. Now I have someone directly to reach out to because they just said that they're doing it in their program. So this also could just be a nice opportunity to open up some more, space for collaboration across programs. So as we're going through the examples, if there's anything that you are already doing, please just shout yourself out for that. But again, going back to our example, so you want to make sure that you're really setting your residents up to be able to successfully support students with IEPs in general education, and you want to look at it purely from an instructional driver. Some of the shifts that you could think about for your program is really embedding IEP analysis into your lesson planning assignments in your general education methods courses. So in those courses, when your residents have to submit a lesson plan, there's already baked into that assignment and that experience a question or a prompt about them analyzing maybe a focused student's IEP or a group of students' IEPs to make sure that either the goals or accommodations or targeted supports are built into that lesson. So the teacher is starting to just cultivate that practice of doing that on a regular basis as they are planning, not something that's like I taught the lesson and the kids didn't do well, and then I had to go back and kind of course correct. Or maybe during your clinical seminars where you have your gen ed residents and your special education residents together, having some really specifically curated like case-based discussions around supporting students with IEPs in general education. So that is a conversation that they are not only having, but they're having it with both general education and special education folks in the room. So kind of starting to like build that muscle memory of what it will feel like to have these kind of collaborative conversations when they're either in their placement sites or in that first full-time role. Or potentially could be something like requiring residents to identify how accommodations are going to be, integrated into lesson plans or unit plans or assessments. Just again, really intentionally embedding these activities in the assignments that your residents are already going to be completing. And then if you want to think about what would evidence for success for you as a program look like, you would then have these lesson plans that you could reference back to that have the accommodations and the supports embedded in them. So that'll give you some really important formative feedback around, what the residents are understanding and then where you might need to make some programming tweaks. As students are doing, or as your residents are doing more of this, intentional differentiation in their lesson plans, you would expect to see that also during your observations. So that could be another data point that you could begin to collect as a program to see, what's going well and what needs to shift. And then also looking at just like self-reporting data from your residents and hoping to see some shift in the way that they are, describing like their increased confidence or just like sense of ability to be able to support students with IEPs. So I'm going to pause and just look through the chat. I saw some things coming up, but any questions or input or thoughts that were sparked from folks as we went through this first example of how you can kind of think about breaking up your larger program outcome and addressing it through these different drivers. And again, if you're more of a like verbal processor and you want to raise your hand to unmute and share, please feel free to do that. Great. Okay. I see some great lesson plan template examples. Oh, wow. A custom GPT. That's really interesting. Yeah, I'm going to show you an example of a custom GPT that the High Leverage Practices group put together not too long ago that I've been sharing, and it's been a really, really interesting experience. Wonderful. Were there any hands that popped up? I didn't see any hands pop up. All right, so now let's look at the same outcome, the same desired outcome through the lens of driver 2. And so still, our overarching desired outcome is that our residents are graduating prepared to design and implement instruction that supports students with IEPs in general education. And now we want to look at it through the lens of a key driver around collaboration, really wanting to make sure that we're embedding lots of opportunities for our residents to experience what collaboration between general education teachers and special education teachers needs to look like in order to really create like the communities of success that our students with IEPs need. And so what this could potentially look like as a program design shift is really working with your mentor teachers to model co-planning and co-teaching either with their residents or with other folks that they're working with. So residents have an opportunity to observe that, and then eventually emulate that practice. Having your residents participate in any grade level PLC discussions that are happening around student learning and just making sure that they're getting lots of opportunity to observe these conversations across staff. or working with your residency supervisors to really facilitate structured conversations about collaboration, or maybe some of the challenges around collaboration that residents are having, either with their mentor teacher, working with another general education teacher, really just kind of normalizing that like collaboration is kind of challenging. And when that happens, it doesn't mean that you should shy away from it. It's just an opportunity to get some coaching and support, because it really is such a critical part of success for our students with IEPs. And so then in doing that, some of the markers of success that you can maybe start to look for to see how this is going for your residents is really maybe just kind of like tracking, what is the number of collaborative planning meetings that our residents are taking place in, getting feedback from the mentors that residents are engaging in like more problem solving and are more active in collaborative conversations. And then maybe getting some feedback from residents that they are describing collaboration as just more of a normative part of their process and something that they're feeling really, really confident about. I would say the collaboration piece, again, I think, thinking about this from my vantage point of a K-12 district administrator, is that this piece is so critical and really just difficult to cultivate on a day-to-day basis, that if we had more of our new teachers coming in with just more of an understanding that collaboration is really important, collaboration takes, practice and coaching, collaboration might not always be comfortable, but is like absolutely necessary, I think would just really start to strengthen folks' abilities to engage in inclusive practices on a more consistent basis. And again, any thoughts or reactions to that, please share that. Oh, Kat, you have your hand up. Go ahead and unmute.
Hi, thank you so much for this. Your last session was so helpful, and I'm happy to be here. Um, what you're talking about around collaboration and finding the space for them to both collaborate and problem solve together. Something that I've noticed is challenging is moving from that like assistant, right, role to really perceiving them as a collaborator that they trust. And it takes time to develop that in each sort of dynamic duo, if you will, and sometimes trio, if you're depending on the situation, it takes time to develop that. So I'm just curious, um, if you could speak to that, or maybe you're planning on later, and nurturing that sort of collaboration.
Yeah, so this came up in one of the classes that I was teaching last semester. And it was a group of, and all of the residents that were in like that particular class all happened to be ed specialists. Like they were all becoming special education teachers. And I was feeling that same tension that you were, right? And one thing that I said to them that really I could tell just shifted kind of the way that they thought about the class moving forward, is that I was like, I understand, and this is like what I was saying to them, is I understand, like one of the things that I think it's important for you to understand as a resident is that while you are still a student, like yes, you're still a student who is learning how to do this, you are a student who is learning to step into a role in a profession where you're going to have to be a really proficient problem solver and decision maker. And like your identity as a student probably is not that. As a student, you just like follow the directions and do the things so that you can get the grade, because that's kind of how you've been acculturated to exist as a student. But like that doesn't translate over to teaching. Like being a good student in this program isn't necessarily going to help you build the skills that you need to be a really effective first year teacher. And there does need to be kind of in the second part of your program, like more adopting of an identity of like, I am a problem solver. I am like a team builder. I'm like kind of a leader. That was what I was trying to really communicate to them. And I think speaking to that really explicitly, I could definitely see a shift in some of the residents, because they were like, they just realized that like they weren't students in a traditional sense anymore, and like getting all of your points on this assignment doesn't mean that you're also going to be able to walk into this classroom and implement this IEP or like lesson plan in a really effective way. And so I think thinking about it, yeah, it's a very active conversation. I think also in a lot of the faculty teams within Alder right now is really thinking about how we're incorporating more coaching and kind of like identity construction and like mindset shifting into our courses, and not just focusing on the nuts and bolts of, this is how you write a lesson plan, this is how you get your ed TPA done. And it has just made it's just made things much more interesting and dynamic. I think we're all really appreciating the shift, and the residents are reporting back a lot of really positive things to us as well. And this wasn't a part of your question, but one of the things that it made me think of is another thing that I've noticed is kind of a trend within Alder's program is that many of the assignments that we have the students doing when they are doing lesson planning, or doing like case studies on students, is they're group projects, usually no more than 2 or 3, and we always try to like engineer it so that there is at least one special ed resident who's in the group. So again, they're really kind of working through and practicing like what does it mean for a group of instructors or educators to sit down and try to really like plan something out together. And plan out what it's going to look like in execution as well. And they've been really, really receptive and happy to have those conversations, because it then helps them go back and kind of do that with their mentor teacher or other folks that they're working with, because they've already had a little bit of practice in like a safer space. Perfect. So moving on to our third example. Or a third driver. So same outcome, but third driver, really thinking about sustainability for our residents, and trying to think through how can we, increase alignment and then reduce any unnecessary cognitive overload, because we know there's so much that's already going on for them. Some of the program shifts that you can maybe think about is integrating inclusive instructional practices again into existing coursework instead of adding additional things on. So for this one, and I have a couple of extra resources also that I'll share with you just to kind of contextualize this. But 3 things that I have been sharing a lot in my methods courses, both with our special education residents and then also with our general education residents, are just different planning tools that they can use when they're going through and doing these assignments for case studies, or they're doing these lesson planning assignments, so that they're just being exposed to more ideas and options without having to, just like pull on what is in their brain, because they just have limited, kind of exposure. And so thinking about using like the high leverage practices for students with disabilities, and let me just share that website right now and drop this into the chat. This is a really great, just like concise list of different instructional practices that are evidence-based and research-based and have been shown to be successful working with students with disabilities. So pulling from this list of instructional strategies and having those be the ones that are like intentionally embedded into lesson plans is another way to create some of that that integration and that alignment. Really thinking about what does it look like to scaffold responsibility for that co-planning. And another tool that I have been sharing a lot with residents, and then also with mentor teachers in the moments when I'm talking to mentor teachers, is a tool called DIFIT. That is an AI tool that really supports with differentiation. And so being able to kind of have like a coaching session or a co-planning session with one of those tools pulled up has been shown to be really useful. And then there is another tool that is also an AI tool, but it is very much supportive around like IEPs and working with students who have IEPs. And it's called IEP Playground. And this is another one that I've been sharing a lot with our residents and with our team, so that those are things that can be available as they're navigating through some of those conversations. So, integrating as much into existing practices as possible, and then providing residents and our mentor teachers with really practical tools that they can use when they're having these conversations has been some of the ways that we've really been playing with this idea around giving our residents access to all of the things that they need without increasing their cognitive overload. And so some of the evidence for success that certainly I've been looking at in my courses, and I know some other professors within Alder have been looking at also, is, our residents consistently referencing these different specific inclusive practices in their reflections and then their planning artifacts. Our mentor teachers are reporting that our students are taking a more structured approach to differentiation and picking, like 3 to 5 strategies and just getting really good at those, as opposed to trying something new every single time. And then that just our residents are reporting more confidence in being able to apply inclusive practices over different classroom settings and over time. And so, of course, whenever we're talking about integration of all of these different ideas, we want to make sure that we have like a process for taking our ideas into implementation. And so the tool that we wanted to share for this session is actually adapted from the Residency Program Improvement Workbook, specifically from Module 2. And this is a PDSA planning cycle that really is just a very effective systematic tool that you can use when you're thinking about program improvement. And so there are 4 very specific phases that you can see from the image that is on the screen. And the way that this maps to the conversation that we have just been having is, if you think about like the outcomes and the drivers that you really want to focus your program design around, this attaches to the plan cycle of the PDSA cycle. What is it that we're trying to improve? The specific brainstorm around design shifts will turn into, these are the things that you want to practice and test. And then the evidence of success, or the markers of success that you kind of hope to see initially, that turns into kind of what you will study as you are going through this process and this practice. And so what was just dropped into the chat for you is the session workbook for today. And in there, you will see a table that kind of breaks out the design drivers and the PDSA cycle and aligns that with some guiding questions to support the conversation that you're going to have in a breakout room in just a second. But before we go into the breakout room, remember that when you're going through a PDSA cycle, again, the intention is to start small, to start with something very targeted and specific, and move through the cycle with that so that you can start to gain some momentum and gain some really observable progress, so that will then fuel whatever continuous, improvements you want to make over time. And this is also speaking to like the sustainability for us also. So please just kind of keep that in mind. This isn't a huge overhaul. This really is about small incremental progress. And so once you're in your breakout room, please take a couple of minutes just to kind of silently brainstorm about one program design shift that you would like to think about for next semester. You, of course, are not going to have time to kind of brainstorm through all of this, but just think kind of generally, what is a specific change that you would like to test? Where would you like to see this take place? Is it in coursework and seminar and placement? And what would you expect to have happen? And just begin to articulate that to one another so that you can get feedback and support in refining your idea and thinking about how you might take this back to your larger teams that you're working with. So again, you can start to get traction on these shifts that you want to make. Everyone, we are going to transition pretty quickly into a break. But if you go ahead and open up the chat, I did want to offer just 4 different questions that you can think about how you can take, kind of what we're thinking about and talking about today in this space, and then bring it back to your teams. because the reality is, no one person owns this work. And so you'll want to be able to take some of the thoughts and the tools that we've been looking at over the last 2 sessions and bring those back to the larger groups that you're working with. And so those questions are just some questions that you could choose, 1 or 2 to think about, or you could reflect on all of them, and really just kind of set yourself up for some success around how you're going to take the work that we've been doing together here and bring it to your larger teams.
Welcome back from your break. So over the last 2 sessions, we've really built this shared understanding of what inclusive teacher prep requires and how programs really move from ideas to intentional design. But as more diverse candidates enter the profession, inclusive prep isn't only about how we prepare teachers for students, but it's really about how we design programs that also support the candidates themselves. And so I'm really excited about the panel today because Dr. Laura Irvin Kassab from San Jose State University and Dr. Megan Kosher from the Thompson Policy Institute are here today with us. And they're going to help us explore how inclusive approaches show up in the candidate experience and what it really takes to design programs that are both supportive and sustainable. So thank you both for being here today. I'm really excited to dive into this conversation. And to kick us off, I'd really love to start with the bigger picture. And so, Megan, given your extensive work in developing dual licensure pathways and the new research report that just came out from the Thompson Policy Institute, I'd love for you to share a bit about maybe what you're seeing as we think about more inclusive and sustainable models. And I know you have some slides that you will also like to reference. So I'd love for you to kick us off.
All right, great. Hi, everyone. I am so happy to be here. Megan Kosher. Right now, I am a professor and executive director of the Thompson Policy Institute on Disability. It's at Chapman University. Before that, I have to give you a little bit of background. I am traveling right now, but I am so passionate about this. I had to still join. So I'm outside of Jamba Juice, and so traveling, and so this is we'll just hope that it holds, that my Wi-Fi holds, and it's not too noisy for y'all. So before, I've been at the Thompson Policy Institute, leading the Thompson Policy Institute 6 years. So happy to see so many people on the call. Before that, I led teacher ed programs. I was the director of teacher education at Chapman University, and then also director of teacher education at Trinity Washington University in Washington, D.C. And in both of those roles, designed dual credential programs. And so I'm also about 27 years ago now, I also completed a dual credential program. So I am a big believer in this work, and also so excited to join in you all and working toward creating more inclusive options. So some of the things that I'll talk about today are going to come from my own experience developing these programs, developing the dual credential program here at Chapman and their team program, even though I'm at Thompson Policy, leading the Thompson Policy Institute. In addition, at the Thompson Policy Institute, we do a lot of work in teacher preparation and preparing teachers through grant funding through the Gates Foundation. And so you'll hear a little bit about that as I go. But back to Brooke's question. So a couple things I thought I would talk about today is just a little bit about my experience in developing a dual credential program as the leader of a teacher ed program, but then also some of what we're seeing across the state in terms of what's happening in dual credential programs and what people are saying about the strengths and what we need to address in terms of dual credential programs, which is connects really well to some of the items and topics that Dr. Johnson brought up earlier today. So I'm actually going to start there. I'm going to start with what's happening across the state in terms of dual credentialing. If you're familiar, a bill just passed, AB 1119, and it requires a working group to look at dual credential pathways for teacher preparation in the state. It was the bill was put forward by Assemblymember Patel, and so as part of that work, the Thompson Policy Institute, in collaboration with the Cedar Center and other collaborators, we did a statewide analysis of what dual licensure looks like, what general education, special education licensure looks like. A real broad landscape analysis of what this looks like across the state. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to share a link to this report, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of what we found. So this was done, shout out to Dr. Nat Hansuvada. Many of you may know Nat from Cal State Long Beach, Dr. Andrew Wall, Dr. Marquita Grano-Shire, who is a professor emeriti and now chair of the CTC, and Audrey Sandoval Gomez, who is my co-leader here at the Thompson Policy Institute, and then also Kaylee Hokie, who's a graduate research assistant here at TPI. So we did a landscape analysis of what does this look like across the state when people are trying to develop programs that offer candidates a pathway for dual credentials. Now, this is not to present it as every candidate should be going through a dual credential program. Rather, this is a pathway that offers an opportunity for teachers to leave their programs ready to teach students with disabilities. Similar to my own experience having a dual credential, my first job was as a general ed first grade teacher, but I felt really prepared to teach students with disabilities in my class when they entered my class because I also had that special education credential. I had done special education student teaching. And so in similar ways, one might not go into teach in special education or as a special educator, but be better prepared, have that content to be really well prepared to teach students with disabilities. So we took a look at what does that look like across the state. We did an analysis of independent not-for-profits, UCs, and CSUs. I'll just provide some summary for the report. The Cal State University, there were 8 dual credential programs out of the 23 programs. At independent not-for-profits, there were 13, and at the UCs, there was 1 dual credential program, and that was multiple subject and deaf and hard of hearing. But so what were some of the big things that came out of this report? One was that there's a huge variation in credit count. So there credit count ranged from at the master's level from between 53 units to 40 units. So across programs across the state, you can see that there's a large difference in the amount of credit it takes to earn these dual credentials. Another piece in the undergraduate, it was the same, where there was a variation between 99 units and 115 units at the undergraduate level. So you see a lot of difference in across programs and how they're approaching the credit count. This also comes up when we interview deans and other stakeholders about the barriers in implementing this type of credential. So some of our key findings was we are seeing a lot of growth in dual credential availability over the last 5 to 7 years. Most programs are still offered at the post-bac or graduate level. There is a lot of variation. People are calling it different things. People are, in terms of structure, naming. The independent not-for-profit colleges and universities offered faster and lower program units. So they were faster to completion and they were less credits than the CSUs. Most programs, and this will come up in some of the feedback too, and really connects to what Dr. Johnson said today. Most programs are offering what Dr. Linda Blanton, they did an analysis around types of dual credential programs across the country. And they looked at, are these programs merged? Do they provide really inclusive experiences for candidates, or are they discrete? Meaning you do a general ed placement and then you go and you do a special education placement in a self-contained setting. And really what we're seeing across the state is mostly those types of programs. One space for general education and one space for special education. Very few programs were able to offer candidates clinical experiences where they're in an inclusive setting the entire year with a special educator and a general educator collaborating in an inclusive environment. And so you can see, and that comes out in some of the findings as well in terms of the opportunities for our students. Only 2 of the programs that we reviewed offered some sort of inclusive option for the clinical experiences. So that came out loud and clear from the candidates. Following up on that, we interviewed deans. Thank you for sharing. We interviewed deans to ask them what they thought the barriers were to the programs. Now, this is probably not something that's going to be surprising to people on this call. One is that it's too much. It's too expensive. We're basically stacking 2 programs on top of each other. And then we're asked, we already have issues with access to affordable teacher preparation. We don't want people going into debt. And now we're asking them to pay for 10 or 15 more credits, right? To earn a dual credential. And that's something that they felt that candidates just were not in a space to do. The next was the complex and challenging clinical practice placement. And so, Dr. Johnson, I really connected with what you were talking about in this space, because a lot of the stakeholders that we interviewed said they just can't find inclusive settings to send their candidates to where they're really going to be able to see great inclusive practices. So as a collective, that's something that I think that we could do a lot of work on collectively, is how do we make sure that we're identifying those spaces? How do we make sure that we're working together with our district partners to say, hey, we really need to work together and collaborate to make sure that our candidates are able to see great inclusive practices. And that may be a conversation with the district about how they can increase their inclusive classrooms, how they might be able to work alongside educator preparation programs to increase their inclusive offerings. So more of that collaborative approach, but that came up a lot. It was difficult to find practices, inclusive practices. Another highlight that came out of that connected with what Dr. Johnson was talking about earlier today, and I'm really curious to know from a problem of practice standpoint what you all thought, is candidates are getting a dual credential and they're learning how to teach it and they're learning all these inclusive practices, and then there are not jobs in inclusive settings. And they are most of the jobs that are available for a special educator are in self-contained settings. And that is not a setting that they are envisioning that they're going to go and they're going to have this collaborative space. And then they're going into settings, these very, very self-contained settings that do not mirror the context that they were that perhaps they were educated in, or some of the practices that they were introduced to in their teacher preparation program. So kind of some thinking through that. It's one of working alongside, working together to support those district practices and more inclusive practices, and then also understanding that candidates are having these expectations that they're going to be able to go and work in these really inclusive settings. And sometimes that's not the case. And so there's a little bit of a misalignment there. And then we also saw, which many of you on the call may experience, is that we need some incentives for this work, right? We need some, I always think too, we have a lot going on. Faculty in educator preparation programs have a lot going on, in terms of just regular everyday accreditation cycle work and working with students and making sure that we're supporting them in their clinical placement. And it is an ask, as somebody who's revised the program to be a dual credential program, we really have to collaborate with each other. Sometimes that takes changing mindset. Sometimes that takes us really working together to re-envision what we think we want teachers to be able to know and do when they leave our programs. So that came out loud and clear through our report. So the link to the report, I'll leave you with some of those as our biggies in terms of the outcomes. We've also made some recommendations, and this was then presented on a panel at the California Council for Teacher Education and will be used in part as part of some of the work of the AB 1119 working group. So I'm going to stop there. I don't know if anything, I know that was kind of a quick overview, if anything came up for you all, or if you all had any questions about that.
I'm going to chime in because there was something that we discussed that I really wanted you to make sure that we highlight, is that when you brought it up around that, the experiences of these very siloed clinical experiences, but something that a residency program that you had shared with us, you mentioned this was off when we were planning, about the interventionist position that a residency model is implementing as also a sustainability model. It's a para-interventionist position. And so could you share just a really quick overview of what that position is and that experience for that candidate?
Sure. Yeah, I'd love to. So this is some of the work that the Thompson Policy Institute has been doing around sustainable teacher residency. How can we make sure that we sustain these amazing residencies that we all have beyond the funding that we currently have through the Commission on Teacher Credentialing? And so some of the work that we've been doing with our partners at the Thompson Policy Institute is developing models that can last, and that's through a dual role residency, or some people call it a sustainable residency. So I'm just going to share a few slides, and then if you're interested, I can pop my email in the chat. Feel free to connect with me after. So in these models, there are several different sustainable models. In this paraprofessional model, we're really looking at starting with a mind shift around residency, where we're embedding it into the school system. And I'm happy to send these slides, or I think, Brooke, I shared them with you. If you want to share those slides widely, it's totally fine. We're looking at embedding these credential opportunities into the school system ecostructure. And that requires some really creative thinking about how we design these residencies and the roles of our residents in schools. So one model that we've been working with in the state, and I'll give you an example, is the intervention paraprofessional model. So a little bit about just for the sake of time, this does not use any CTC funding. This does not use any grant funding. This is completely funded with reallocated funds from district funds, okay? So you have two open paraprofessional positions, or you have some intervention funding that you have. That's $28K a piece. What you do is you re-envision the role of the resident. Okay, so this is this bottom one here, where that resident is spending part of the day as a paraprofessional or an interventionist, and I'll talk about that in a second, and then part of the day as a resident. So you're taking those really hard to fill paraprofessional positions or really difficult to fill interventionist positions, and you're re-envisioning those funds so that now the resident is spending part of their time doing their student teaching and co-teaching, and then they're spending part of their time providing intervention to groups of students. So let me share a little bit about how this looks like. And so this is an example from one of the districts that we worked with here in California. And so Marcus, he's a high school teacher candidate. they do a block schedule here. And he's working in the mornings, providing tutoring and academic intervention. So if you think about a 4-period block schedule, he's spending 2 of those periods being paid as an interventionist to provide intervention. He's gotten some training. And then 2 additional periods, he's co-teaching with his mentor teacher, who in this case is a long time. This mentor teacher in particular had never had a teacher candidate before in their classroom, so something he kind of felt like he was ready to do. And so what's the cool thing about this experience for Marcus? Now, Marcus is getting a general education, mathematics, single subject credential. But what Marcus is able to do is he is able to get a lot of skills and build a lot of skills doing this intervention for students, so that when he is a high school mathematics teacher, he's going to have some great experience with really being able to reach students with disabilities in his classroom. As you can see here, we calculated the number of hours that these students got for academic intervention, which the principal executive director of the high school was really excited about. He's able to apply his coursework directly, those high leverage practices that we talk about. Marcus is able to use those. And then he's really able to fill also a hard to fill position. So I'm just going to I'll stop here with this. This is one of the districts that was our collaborative partner was Corona Norco Unified. This is the assistant superintendent of human resources. And these are just some quotes about what he had to say about this interventionist model. Not only is it a real benefit to the school, then it is also a sustainable residency model that schools are able, educator preparation programs and districts are able to continue on should funding for these residencies no longer be available.
I appreciate you lifting up both the system and the candidate experience, and talking about the research that really highlights true inclusive clinical practices are very limited, right? And so how residency can solve some of these issues that we're having. And so I think you sharing that model is really helpful for us to rethink, how are we designing these programs intentionally in collaboration between the LEA and the IHEs to really provide those true inclusive clinical experiences. So Megan, I really appreciate that and sharing and having you share all of your resources. We've made sure that we put the slides in the chat along with the report too. And so I really appreciate that sort of high level overview and some of the, the outcomes from your report. And really, and one of the data points in your report brought up 1 in 7 students has a disability, right? Which means inclusive practice is not this like niche skill. It's really core to teaching. And so Laura, if you could, I'd love for you to bring this down to that program level and share how some of these ideas are showing up in practice at San Jose State, especially in supporting both candidates and faculty. And knowing that you don't currently have a residency program, but you're doing some amazing work. And so I'd love for us to hear from you regarding that.
Great. Well, thank you so much. As I get started here, I would like to share with everyone in the room that I am also legally blind and neurodiverse. So I spent about 15 years in K-12 until my vision kind of progressed to a point where I couldn't see all of my students in the classroom anymore. And I thought that might be a little dangerous for a continuation high school teacher. My kids were awesome, though. I miss them a lot. So one of the first things I'd like to say is that I have had feedback. I now teach in a teacher education program. And I'm not in the special education program portion. I'm in the general education, multiple single subject. And I've had feedback from quite a few students that they appreciate me not only being disabled, but also sharing openly about my own disability, that it made them feel like they could talk about their experiences with disability in the classroom, and that we've had incredibly rich conversations. So I teach the inclusion and mainstreaming class, I have also worked extensively with social emotional learning with the Center for Reaching and Teaching the Whole Child, and have crafted, reimagined, and thought of our class about creating classroom learning communities. Those are in 2 different semesters and they follow one another. And so something that's really important to think about is the through line when we're working with our multiple single subject candidates. If you don't necessarily have a residency, or even if you do, in what ways can the foundation in understanding internalized ableism, inherent ableism, and the ways in which students start to shift their views about behaviors related to disability, and then how that can funnel into a course that celebrates student assets and really builds community based on students. So that's kind of a big through line idea there. Through this honest conversation, we've also really begun that we have quite a few candidates who are coming into the programs, special education. We also have a TK3 program, as well as multiple single subject. And we're seeing an increase in candidates themselves who are neurodiverse and are, at least in my class, very open about sharing their disabilities. It popped onto our radar that our candidates might need a little more support, because we saw candidates' student teaching placements sometimes falling apart, sometimes being extremely rocky, and not for problems such as content knowledge or professionalism, i.e., that they knew what they could wear and what time to be there, but rather some of those more subtle social situations that is really hard to read. And so we're currently exploring ways in which we can create better supports for the candidates themselves who are neurodiverse, who are coming into the career. And it's beyond a webinar on professionalism. One of the things we've already done was with our multiple subject supervisors, had someone from a local social worker who works specifically with employment for disabled people come in and do kind of a 1-day, what do you need to know about neurodivergence, and how to support students, our credential candidate students, in executive function issues, but also in how to have some of these conversations around how things that are very normal and natural and kind of like, well, duh, moments for people who are neurotypical aren't quite so obvious, right? Like, how much do candidates share about a big problem is boundaries, and like, how much do I share about my personal life as the teacher with the students, right? In what conversations is it okay for me to join in with, I love Naruto comic books too, and then how to stop, because oversharing or taking over a conversation can sometimes be problematic. So right now we're exploring how can we support some of those less tangible but really essential needs for the candidates. In addition to how do we find the time and space to do that, how can we open up conversations with our LEA partners around what kinds of shifts need to happen for HR and potentially for administrators on noticing and recognizing when something is a challenge due to a neurodivergent issue versus an openly antagonistic kind of, or misunderstanding. You know what I mean? So those are some of the things that we're really wrestling with, is what supports can we as a program provide, and then how do we interface with our LEAs, because the statistics are between 11 and 20% of our candidates who are coming into university are identifying themselves as neurodivergent.
I love that. And I love I appreciate that level of conversation, that we haven't had deep engagement around supports beyond TPE 6, right? Like they're still couched in this like professionalism, but it's beyond what's listed there. And there's a need. And I know both of you had shared that there were trainings that you've been engaging faculty with. So faculty have a different, they're learning alongside, and hopefully them having a better understanding of supporting candidates. I mean, this is all going to shift the candidate's experience. If I had a professor that understood time blindness or things like that, things that come with neurodiversity, might be set up for success earlier on. So I think just thinking through those program shifts, especially when we talk about the disconnect between the experience in preparation and then the experience of, being hired as a first-year teacher. And so I think these are wonderful opportunities in spaces like this to have these conversations. And Laura, I know on our, when we talked last, you said, I just want to hear what other people are doing too. Like we all have these no duh. Now that's kind of the joke in this deep dive is our last panel, she was like, duh, doesn't everybody do that? I'm like, no, they don't. And so we would love an opportunity to open that up and to hear from other programs and engage in conversation, maybe for the next couple minutes, and see if does anyone have any questions for Megan and Laura about how it shows up in their work, or something that you'd like for them to expand on or clarify, or or Laura and Megan, if there was something else that just popped in, you're like, oh, I forgot to say this thing. I do that sometimes. So if there's something else you want to add.
There's one thing I want to add, and it's something I tell my student teachers all the time when they complain about, like, well, why didn't my university professors teach the way that you're teaching in this class? And that is, even in teacher education faculty, even in special education faculty, well, less so in special education faculty, but in teacher education faculty, none of them have ever taken my inclusion course, right? Like none of them have ever had to take some of these courses for teacher preparation in the iterations they are now. Maybe some of our younger faculty who came to us from teaching have, but not every faculty member in teacher education has taught, has a credential, or was credentialed here in California, where it is such a big portion of the standards for the teaching profession. So that's when you said, like, the duh, doesn't everybody do it this way? The culture of experience in teaching within faculty can be so varied that it might be new and revelatory for people to be thinking more inclusively in teacher education spaces. But I'd love to hear from people in the room. So
I was just going to add one thing, that it's not even just the teacher education faculty that are teaching like methods courses or whatever, but they're even, especially in the residency model, which most of us are using in our programs, like those candidates are placed into a mentor's classroom for the duration of the entire year. And sometimes those mentors don't have the background in inclusion or inclusive practices. And so there's this mismatch between what they might be learning in your class and what's happening in their real practice. And so I think like that's why we're all here in this conversation. But I think that's something that needs to be addressed, like in our programs, and like how we design our programs and how we train and select our mentors and how we place our residents, even just making sure that they have opportunities for that inclusion and to see it in practice.
I mean, we'd love to open it up to hear from others, or if you're still processing, if you want to put it in the chat, maybe a word or a phrase that captures your takeaway or what feels most relevant to your context right now, or maybe a small shift that you're considering after hearing from our panelists.
And I'd like to tag on to what Kate was saying, is that perhaps we also want to consider mentor training broadly. It's not just how am I doing inclusive practices with my students in my classroom, how do I work with someone who's neurodivergent? Right. So how do we have a professional relationship? How do I, like, when I see, them wanting to have their note cards when they stand in front of the class? And then how do we communicate with our students about a neurodivergent candidate, and why do they have note cards in their hand when the other teacher doesn't have note cards in the hand? And how do we normalize that kind of thing? So I just wanted to kind of tag on to that. Is a lot of times when we're thinking about professional development, mentor training, we're talking about the practices from teacher to student, but especially in a co-teaching model. I ran a TRIO project, federal grant funded project for language support. And one of the things we saw was like that relationship between the mentor teacher and the teacher candidate. And how do we set things up so that can be successful, and to enhance communication is so essential to that being successful. And in co-teaching, that goes beyond just mentor teacher, teacher candidate, to how do we support those less obvious portions of what it takes to be a successful co-teacher.
We engage in a lot of mentor-teacher conversations about how are we, and it makes me think about where might we be designing really for the system instead of for the candidate, right? And so getting us to start thinking about maybe a backwards design of designing all of these experiences with your most vulnerable candidate in mind, and then backwards designing to ensuring this. I don't know, just lots of my wheels have been turning and spinning since we last spoke. So, and I know we're getting close to noon. So I just want to thank you both very much for your willingness to jump on, Megan, especially when you're traveling. We know how hard it is to jump on and find stable Wi-Fi, and you're sitting at a Jamba Juice. So we appreciate you both being here with us. And we've covered a lot in the last 3 sessions. And so I want to just give us maybe like 2 minutes. If anyone has any pressing questions, you could throw them in the chat or you can raise your hand. Just want to make sure that we have time. And we have, I think in the resources, Kate, tell me if I'm wrong here, but we'll have access to the slides and the report. And we have there, we can get people connected via email. If you wanted to reach out and connect with Megan or Laura to learn more about what they're working on. We love resources, so we love to share resources as well. So we have 3 QR codes for you here. The first one is access to all of the deep dive session resources. So you'll have a link there. And then we need your feedback, because your feedback is what helps shape future sessions as we move forward into planning for this coming school year. So we'd love to hear your feedback. And we have our upcoming event. We have the annual statewide residency symposium. And so there's a QR code for the registration. And it's also, I believe, going to be in the chat. And so we'd love to see you there. Hopefully we see you all there. And then again, if you're thinking through any programs, you want some more support, you have SR Tech and the lab here to support with any of your coaching needs or thought partnership. You can reach out to any of us and we'd be happy to connect with you.
Thank you, everyone.